Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. Venerable Assembly. Ed Goshen, good to see you here. Welcome to Aaron, new timer, first timer. Stephanie, haven't seen you for a while. Good to see you. So, today we continue with what we've been doing for these past, I don't know how many weeks, with looking at a case from the record of Empty Hall. And today we are on case 56, Matsu's One Stroke. Creatively living beyond the pattern, you know? And when you're creatively dealing with a pattern and you have like beyond, you might wonder, like, is that a mistake? Or did they mean to say beyond? I'm not telling. So, first I'll share the case with you. We'll pause and digest it just a little bit, and we'll look at the background of one of the most creative Zen teachers ever, Matsu. We'll look at the role of Matsu in the record of Empty Hall. Then some really practical stuff I think about living free from or in the pattern. And is there something else? Well, there's this part about living in a pit. And then we'll have a Dharma dialogue. So, case 56, Matsu's One Stroke. A monk suddenly appears and says, and without saying anything, he draws 4 lines in front of Matsu. 1 line is long, 3 lines are short. Then he says, without saying 1 line is long and 3 lines are short, without wiping out the 4 lines, and without saying nothing, trying to cover all his bases, I invite the teacher to reply. Matsu just drew 1 long line and said, without saying 1 line is long, 3 lines are short, I've answered you. Zhu Tong, who was much later, by the way, so just to put his laterness in context, he was as far from Matsu in our linear time frame as we are from Shakespeare, so about 500 years. So Zhu Tong's alternate reply to the request would be, the venerable monk was born in a pit. Now, as with all koans, as Edward R. Murrow said, probably not about koans, but he said, if you are confused, you understand. If you are confused, you understand. What's going on? What? So, the old ancient Master Ma was a master at disrupting the divided mind and inviting students into wholeness, to healing the division. So just 1 line. One aspect of our work, especially the Broadgate work of looking at these old stories, these short stories, I've been thinking of them as, in this context, they're really short stories. This one I didn't do a word count, but maybe 100 words, right? It's a short story in 100 words. Amazing how much is conveyed. One aspect is representational, the representational mind. What do these things mean, you know? And the more intimate work, the more essential work is demonstrational. So the case is both representational and demonstrational. In our Western Zen, we emphasize the representational, I think, maybe a little too much. It's important, but I went to a Dharma talk this past week, and the teacher presented it purely, I think, as representational, like a lot of frustrated English majors or something. You know, we take up this literature and work it like we might have in college. That is one aspect. And there is another, more intimate, demonstrational. So let's look a bit at one of the great founders of our tradition, 8th century figure. He lived through most of the 8th century, Matsu. He was the 8th generation in China. The Zen Dharma was just getting established there, having been a very powerful force in Chinese culture for 700-800 years already, but Zen was just flourishing. His name means horse ancestor, and he's often referred to just as Great Master Ma, Ma being horse. It is said that he was named horse because he could extend his tongue and it would cover his nose. You can try it. I know you want to. You know, I can barely touch my nose, but his tongue would cover his nose, it is said. One of the things that's notable is these early masters, these early ancestors, are like cartoon figures, and they get more and more normal over the period of the next 500 years or so until they're just normal people. But the old ones from the early period, and Matsu's in that early period, are very strange. And it's said that his appearance was most unusual. He strode like an ox, and he gazed like a tiger. On the soles of his feet, the veins formed 2 circles. So, you know, on the Buddha's feet in India, on the soles of his feet were Dharma wheels, right? Or was it swastikas? I can't remember. Reverse swastikas, not like the Nazi swastika, but, you know, much earlier. Somebody must know. Anyway, he had something on his feet. And then, and now Matsu in China has just the Enso on his feet. So the Dharma is becoming cyanized. He also lived through a period in China which was one of the most, or perhaps the most greatest disaster in human times. The greatest rate of death, the An Lushan Rebellion, 10 years in the middle of the century, of the 8th century, where at least, some estimates are higher. Some of you might be familiar with Joan Sutherland Roshi's talk on this. She said 2/3 of the population died in this decade. I looked into it, and then the scholars are a little bit leery of that. That's like the high number, but probably at least 25% of the population died during this decade. It was the peak of the Tang Dynasty. Things were cruising. The Chinese nation was gobbling up all these other little countries. They were successful. They're almost taken over Tibet. It was the Roman Empire in Asia. It was huge, 52 million people. It was a huge empire. Things were going great, philosophy, culture, and then the shit hit the fan. And part of that was the Luanshan Rebellion and the An Lushan Rebellion. The An Lushan Rebellion, 25% of the population died. So to give you a little context, maybe 0.2% of the population in the U.S. will die from COVID. A lot of people. You know, that's, I think, figuring 600,000 or so. Probably it'll be more than that at the end of it all. But 0.2%, small. I mean, it's huge, but small number compared to 25%. Imagine the impact on the culture. And it did impact Zen and Matsu. Then the urgency of this human life became so vividly apparent everybody knew lots of people who had died very recently. And Matsu was basically a new teacher, his first decade or so of teaching when the rebellion, when the disaster struck, human-made disaster. Many died from war, but also from starvation and disease. The whole fabric of the society dissolved. And so that urgency was expressed in his no-holds-barred effort to help people awaken. So it is said that he was the first person that used the staff to awaken his students. His strident style of the Hangzhou school foreshadowed the uncompromising training methods of what became the Linji school. And one of probably his most common and well-known teaching expressions was, "This very mind is Buddha. This very mind is Buddha." That's within the context, especially culturally, of hundreds of years of teaching that the Buddha mind was something that could be arrived at after long periods of disciplined practice with precepts, meditation, and insight. Matsu taught this very mind is Buddha. He was also one of the most prolific masters of all time, even more so than Mel Weitzman. He had 139 successors. 139 successors. Amazing. And we meet 9 of them in the Record of Empty Hall. So that's a little about Matsu. We can return to anything there in Dharma Dialogue. So now let's look a little bit at how Matsu appears in the Record of Empty Hall. And basically, he's been lurking. As I mentioned in Josan yesterday, he's been lurking in the background. And he'll continue to do so. And in a sense, we know Matsu, he's like the source of the stream. We know him and his teaching through what comes downstream, through his successors. In fact, this case, case 56, is the only case in which he appears directly. He does appear, of course, and there is a record of his teachings. Dogen relied on his expression quite a lot, especially, for example, in Dogen's teaching on Zazen. There's the famous story about polishing the tile. So now, when Tetsugan saw my notes, she's like, "Okay, so I'm not going to be there, so you're going to really geek out on this." Yeah, so here's a little geek out section on the Record of Empty Hall. 14 of the 55 cases so far have involved Matsu being off stage, 25%. 7 more cases to come involve his direct successors, several of whom he taught also, but received transmission from someone else, especially Shurto, also appear in the record. For example, in case 94, Yao Shan's arrow, and also in just the case from a couple days ago, case 54, Danja's lucky guy, and it sucks to be you. Danja was also a student of Matsu who eventually went and trained with Shurto. There was this foci of Matsu and Shurto, and many students went between both of them. The Matsu lineage resulted in what became the Rinzai school, and Shurto resulted in the Soto school. Nanchuan was one of his direct successors. He appears in 6 cases here, including one early on, Nanchuan's debt of gratitude to Matsu, and also coming up this week, 57, Jiaozhou bows and withdraws. We also had in case 7, Magu's bodacious presentation. This is a little bit of a review too. It's kind of a sneaky review. Magu's bodacious presentation. Magu was a direct successor of Matsu. We have coming up next week, case 62, Sanju Yin's crossing over. We had case 17, Jitong's donkey brays, and then just yesterday, in case 55, Jitong delivers a letter from Matsu. Very creative stuff, by the way, in this community that came up from the letter exercise. It was great to see. Breaking the patterns, and then also Jitong comes up again in case 60. Jitong's more. We also had case 18, Guizhong's Song of Himself, and Guizhong's Plain Rice, the woman in Samadhi, you may remember. And we have coming up this week, Guizhong's Roughness. In 19, we had Layman Pong, who was a successor of Matsu. Layman Pong's Mixed and Broken Pieces, along with another of Matsu's direct successors, Dame, Great Plum. And also then next week we have case 65, All Together is Peak. We had case 23, Zhang Jing and the Disappearing Circle. And in case 31, we had Yunman's Got Words. And that involved this expression, Great Master Ma said, all words and speech are the Kanadeva school. We have next week, the first day of my 66th year, next Saturday, we have Baizhang's One Person. And then we have 92, Baizhang's Difficult Hall, and 64, Shizhou's Knowing Yet Not Knowing. That's how Matsu, that's how much Matsu is involved in the record of Empty Hall. So, patterns and freedom. That's the representational meaning of this case. Patterns and freedom. They go together, right? You have to have the pattern to break it. And so that's so true in our practice. You know, part of, and I see this some in the Zen Facebook world, which I occasionally dip into when my tolerance for bullshit is very high. Not so much the Rinzai Facebook thing. That's good. But a lot of the other stuff I see on Facebook is just old white guys off-gassing. Nothing personal to those of you whom that fit that demographic, like myself. Anyway, so the patterns are kind of like the bass and the percussion, right? I'm reluctant to say anything about music because some of you know so much more about music than I do whenever it comes up, unless it's Leonard Cohen or Lucinda Williams or, Bob Dylan. I have nothing to say. But I think it's like the bass and percussion. I actually even looked it up on the internet just to make sure I was right about that. It's establishing the pattern. So then freedom, it's kind of like the vocal solo, right? The electric guitar, but it really has to work together in practice. One doesn't arise without the other. And both forms are really important. Both modes, maybe would be a better word. And, we certainly see that in our students. Some people are really good at establishing the pattern, and then they grind that pattern to death. That's a way to kill the practice. It's also important to have that breaking the pattern aspect of it, that willingness to change the cycle at the drop of the hat. That's definitely present in the monastic mode of practice. There's a cycle, you're going along, suddenly everything changes. And part of the training is to, be a plum so that when things change, you can change with them. In householder practice, strangely somehow, it's actually possible to really dig a rut with the practice, much more so than in monastic practice, community practice, where you've got a lot of input from others going on around you. And it's a danger in practice. The other side's dangerous too. Just the expression of freedom without real grounding, without your feet really touching the bottom of the lake, just playing around on the top. And it's a big kind of paradigm shift to move from kind of a regular life to actually becoming a student. That's a big paradigm shift, a big break of the pattern of being a normal person, being just a fine normal person, to making that shift to being a practitioner. And actually, I think that it's harder now for people to make that shift than it has been at any time in my Zen time, which is however many years, almost 45 years. I think it's more difficult now, and I'm not sure exactly why that is, but I do think that is what I'm seeing. It isn't so hard to become a parishioner. So people become parishioners, and the actual number of Zen parishioners is much greater than it was 45 years ago. 10 times, I don't even know, 20 times, it's a lot bigger. But the number of students, the people who have become practitioners, that second, third Oxfording picture, which we've talked about recently, that number seems to, in the context of that growth, the ratio is much different. It's much smaller. Almost everybody, there were like 0 parishioners in 1977. There were essentially 0 parishioners, and everybody, this small group of people in the country, everybody was a practitioner. That's shifted dramatically. So I think it's really cool that in this new mode also, that there are, with our vine of obstacles particularly, just speaking for us, there are a lot of people doing practice as practitioners. It's great to see. And I commend you at making that paradigm shift. And that's one shift, establishing the pattern. And then, of course, it's also important to break the pattern, to be free from and also to be free within the pattern. A lot of that is really putting intention primary, rather than actually the what you're doing, putting the why primary. Let's see, a couple other things here in terms of the pattern. Things that have come up recently, and I know that, it's a struggle for many people, practitioners, to honor the pattern and then honor daily life. And that's especially difficult, I think, in family life when there are children, and finding that way to establish the pattern and be free from the pattern is most challenging. But looking around, I see people, not necessarily people with children, who have other circumstances that make that also challenging. So there's method and creativity, really mastering the method, beginning with the breath, the liturgy, the relationships, and then, finding ways to be creative within the method. That's what makes it alive. It's so-called what makes it our own. If we're just devoted to the method, it really hasn't become integrated yet. There's also working with koan and keyword, and working with mu, for instance. If we make it into a routine, if we make it into a rut, essentially, and just keep digging that thing, digging that rut deeper, asking rotely, what is mu? Bringing the mind rotely back to mu. It's not freedom. It just digs the divided mind a deeper rut in a spiritual context. So with Mu, with any keyword, with any koan. It's also essential that we establish the skill, the basic skill, and then find ways to be creative within that basic pattern. That's when we become masters of the method, and when we can be free with it. So we have to not only ourselves ask Mu, we ask Mu in such a way that the floor, the walls, the roof, the birdies, our friends, the mail carrier. So everybody is asking Mu. That's one way to break the pattern. Another way to break the pattern, which is, I think, really positive stuff. We haven't talked about it much, but if at all, recently. But one of the big movements now in Western Zen particularly is the awareness of whiteness and heterosexuality as normative. And really taking a look at those patterns that were established really in the 70s and 80s as Zen became established here. And it's related to like the boomer worldview and all these things that then have been transmitted, through these years of practice. A number of people doing really good work in that way. Recently, Anne Gleig, I just was listening to a talk of hers, Lama Rod Owens, Larry Young, Angel Kodo Williams, and Soto Zen, really examining how it is that, we're, and there's some resistance, which is kind of surprises me, looking at some of the stuff by Anne Gleig and her comments about the stuff that she receives, and she just takes screenshots, puts this stuff out there. You're gonna talk crazy to me, everybody's gonna know. So she copies her Facebook message stuff and just posts it, and some of it is like embarrassing. These are practitioners and Buddhist scholars, and they're saying this stuff. It's clear, really attached to this pattern. Don't disrupt my white pattern, whatever you do. So it's vital stuff that we break those patterns of privilege and assumption that everybody is like us, and if you're not like us, then we gotta push you out, make you uncomfortable. That's not Buddhism. That's privilege. I think in my own situation, I've long had sensitivity to that. Partly just the way I was raised. We were very poor, and that actually was incredibly helpful to me. Large Catholic family, lived on the outskirts of this small town, and was surrounded by the Native American reservation, Fond du Lac Reservation, and played with Indian kids until I went to grade school. And so I, not only through poverty, but from identifying in some kind of visceral way with the Native community, I've, and through my career in education also, I've been an advocate for people that are othered, and, you're not like us, so just kind of stand to the side. So I've, and I think it's important that we continue that work, obviously, and the Buddha Dharma is not going to survive in the West as a function of boomer white privilege. That's one of the pits we've been born into. That's one of the pits Zen has been born into in this cultural milieu. And we've all got to climb out of it together. The thing about pits is that, you're not there alone. So we can look around and see what's going on in the pit, and be together in the pit when that's the thing to do, but also work together to transform the pit together. If you're confused, you understand. That's what I have this morning. So I will bow, and then we will have Dharma dialogue.
you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please just use the raised hand feature in the reactions button or next to your name in the participants pane, and then Dosha will call on you.
Brian.
Could you possibly highlight a little more this distinction between parishioner and practitioner? What does it
Parishioner,
look like?
practitioner. Yeah, those are unfortunate. It was hard for me to keep them straight too. Oh, yeah. Well, so a parishioner is somebody who has belief in in the in whatever religion we're talking about in our context, belief in the Zen path, some fluency with the terminology. Every religion's got its terminology and set of practices and literature and customs. It hasn't happened that much in this group, but what I used to see, particularly in in-person people groups, is that when people in-person groups, when people started to come, they'd often have like long hair and wear colorful clothing. And then after a year or two, their hair gets shorter, their clothing choices change. So um, and that's fine, of course. It's part of the pattern. And then practitioner is somebody who's really devoted to personally realizing the fruit of the path for the benefit of themselves and others. So not just believe in it, but to actually verify it. And that's a message. Well, when we came to Omaha, that was our message. And it felt to us that the message was not so well received here. And not like people had a problem with it. It was just hard to communicate it in a way that people could hear, And so, kind of beating the drum again and again. But anyway, that's what a practitioner is. And so a practitioner is a person that's moving from that second ox to the third ox, fourth ox, etc. Is engaged in the path as a living thing rather than as a faith. So that's what makes Zen quite different than many other forms of religious expression. And I think that's one of the things that makes delivering the message and receiving the message challenging, because it's quite different than the religious environment that we're in these days, where a stage 2 person is pretty much all there is. That's all the models, that's all the patterns there are out there. So it's really important for others and for yourself to break that pattern and to become a practitioner. That is really a great service to others, because then people can look and say, oh, that's what a practitioner looks like. It's harder when there's just teachers, because students don't have the model then. But I think in the Vine community, we've been much more successful at attracting people, basically, that are interested in doing that kind of work. Martin.
I have just a comment on the historical context of Matsu. That it seems like there have been, how am I trying to say this? That teachers in those time periods of great upheaval, that something happens in terms of like Zen takes a kind of another next level sort of development. Because if memory serves, Dogen lived through a similar, very bloody, politically horrible time period.
Right. There is something there, and so through that adversity, often something new comes out. We see that in individual lives as well, but definitely is that pattern. And I didn't go all into it, but also there was this big shift in that period the Silk Road and the merchants on the Silk Road actually were changing their relationship to power and the means of production. And there was revolution and chaos through the whole route. And Matsu actually was born in one of the capital cities that was right on the Silk Road. So that innovation of that connection in trade also led to these huge changes. So like globalization, I mean, we are living in a period, maybe just kind of early in this period, right? That's how it seems. We're early in this period of massive change. Who knows where we're going? But I'd guess that formats like this, in terms of the Dharma, are going to be much more predominant than previous forms of Dharma work. There's so many advantages. There are disadvantages, but there are many advantages. So I would expect that one of the outcomes will be things like this going forward. Tara.
I'd like to say first that if confusion is understanding, I think I'm in the right place. I'd like to go back to something you said about, it sounded like for householders, attaching to pattern can be a pitfall, and maybe, or maybe it's just sort of like a tendency that householders have. And, I think of that and it resonates because I think there's so much in householder life that feels like the hat is always dropping. So pattern can almost be like a safety net or a sense of safety.
I just missed just a couple words before sense of safety.
Just that I think pattern, like when in householder life, I think that it feels like there's always hats dropping, like things are always, kind of chaotic and in motion, and pattern can bring that sense of safety, which can be an illusion, but maybe if you could just say how to like work with that or, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so in domestic life generally, that's what domestic is, right? Pattern. I mean, that's what we did by transitioning from hunter-gatherers to when we domesticated ourselves, moved into the householder life pattern. So 4 walls, we established the pattern so we can do a much more regular life. And then, of course, we have especially modern living with all sorts of stuff going on, work here, work there, the car, etc. So for much of that, freedom within the pattern is going to be the essential skill. So you're driving your kids to school. You're, at a certain time every day, So being a person that's free within the pattern is really important. And also to keep practice alive, it's important to have the fluidity and flexibility with the routine to change it when possible, to keep it fresh. I've told this story maybe too much, but one of the stories that comes to mind about this, I led a retreat in Alaska. It's a very beautiful place, and I was up there 3 times, and this wonderful older couple owned this house with goats and everything. Actually, we had, during work period, one of the sessions, we had baby goats, and so some of the Zen students were assigned to bottle feed the baby goats. It was like one of the most powerful Dharma teachings ever. They were like, oh, I get it. These goats unabashedly, sucking those bottles, just completely wholeheartedly one doing. Anyway, at the end of this one session, the woman who she was kind of on the periphery. Her husband was much more of the Zen student. She came and asked if I would go for a walk with her. I said, sure. We go for a walk. Well, she wanted to talk about her husband, which I couldn't really do. But the first thing she said to me was, he's sat 40 minutes morning and night for 20 years. And he's worse now than he was 20 years ago. He had the pattern, but he didn't have the freedom yet to apply the Dharma in his relationship, at least from his wife's perspective. And I thought, I can kind of see that. So Thank you. How about, I don't know who's next here, Patrick?
It's interesting that Matsu, for being such a significant teacher, really, only appears in person once to be tested by kind of this indignant student on the stupid question. Um, does he appear in other koans, and is there a significance that Zhutang selected this one koan for him to appear, where he's answering basically a very dumb question?
Well, yeah, it's kind of like a math game, right? And he says almost nothing. Also, just. So I think that's why Zhutang selected it, because he gave Matsu the opportunity to just draw one line. But there is. Matsu is also probably the first teacher that they collected a record on. So there was a record. There is a record of Matsu. I think the Cleary brothers translated it early on. So that's out there. I think it's one of those records. I'm not sure about this, but I think it's one of those records that was gathered like 200 or 300 years later. So it's definitely we're dealing with the misty times of myth. But yeah. So what do you think, Patrick? Why did he choose this one?
I suppose the single line, if you were to communicate only one and simple thing, the single line leaves nothing lacking.
And you say dumb question? Is it like because it's kind of a trick,
Yeah, I guess not dumb, but the spirit of the question seems to be like trying to put him into a trap. Really testing Matsu, this great teacher.
Yeah. Well, and maybe dumb, but also quite brave. I mean, I said, he was one of the first teachers to beat people up. So he really put his life on the line, by doing something like that. This cute little trick. And then, Matsu is his famous teacher, so there's probably 1,000 people watching this thing unfold. And he comes forward and does this. So, give him some credit, is all I'd say. Ralph.
Yeah, patterns and getting stuck are. I'm good at getting stuck. So I'm curious whether you have what advice you might have for getting unstuck and how to break that pattern. What sorts of things have you seen work or that look like they work?
Well, yeah. So one thing is the mindfulness of the pattern, right? And you really getting a clear bead on how the mind is and what brings the heart to want to stay stuck in that pattern. To really see that. So the pattern is really helpful. Still calms the mind. Really, like in our retreats, whatever in daily life too, sitting an hour, etc., really calms the mind, and that established pattern allows for a certain depth, and then it can be a defense against something. So really being open to what it is that we might be using the practice to defend ourselves against, either as what thoughts, what feelings, what experiences, what might we be using the practice to defend ourselves. So then when we have an insight into that, of course, that's where we got to go, is to open to that which we've been trying to repress with the pattern. So the practice itself, I don't think you need to do anything additional. The practice itself is designed to both establish the pattern and to establish freedom within the pattern. It's just a matter of staying with it. Student-teacher relationship within the community, all those things are really helpful in illuminating the pattern and being free from it. Terry.
Just to some extent, Ralph anticipated my question, but I have a sense that I can turn anything into a pattern. Give me something, I'll turn it into a pattern. And so it's sort of like how to identify it and not to be engaged in a constant back and forth of pattern, break, pattern, pattern, break, break, break.
Yeah, and so me too. And Tetsugan kind of laughs at me like with exercise, like 9 years living on White Bear, and I almost every day would bike when I could, unless it was 20 below, and you know how it is in Minnesota, and 4 feet of snow. When I could, I would bike. And I would bike the same route every time. If she and I went together, we'd do some other pattern. But if it was me, I rode around Bald Eagle Lake. It was about 9 miles. It was a nice amount of riding. So what I do is work within the pattern, really noticing the detail. Within, it seems to be the same route, but of course it's not the same route. Every day is it's a different lake. So really noticing that's one way to be free within the pattern. I don't know if she'd buy that, but that's what I'm saying. Melinda.
Yeah, that kind of leads into my question. It seems once you notice the pattern, let's say tending to overcomplicate matters consistently, that tends to stifle any sense of, freedom and creativity and spontaneity. And so getting to the heart of not only identifying the pattern, but then working within that to have it's almost like you need to bring something else to the table, or maybe it's the simplicity of the one line. I'm not sure. What is it that needs to be embodied or let go? Do
you want to complicate it? No, I'm kidding. I was wondering if you were demonstrating your pattern.
I am.
The pattern you brought up.
I am. And that's the problem. It's like you're in it. How do you get out of it? That is what Ralph asked. That's what Terry asked. That's what I'm asking too.
Yeah.
Being in it, it's hard to see out of it.
Well, one thing that I notice, not speaking to you necessarily, is that it's as if we want to avoid how joyful and wonderful things are. So we come up with a routine to somehow repress that. I don't know where that comes from. It's certainly not like the pleasure principle, but so one of the things we can do is illuminate that, it's kind of like trying to buffer the actual direct experience, which includes pain, of course, and also a great deal of joy and relief and ecstasy, really, So to let go of that gauze that we insist on having between us and direct experience. And I guess part of that is fear that it'll be too much, and too much, and then what happens? I don't know, So I encourage you to really allow yourself that the bliss body Buddha, it's right there in the Sambhogakaya even. So be a Sambhogakaya Buddha. And in your daily life, in your sitting, etc., don't use that to grind out your psychological pattern and then blame the Buddha Dharma for it. It is not the Buddha Dharma. That's you doing it. The Buddha Dharma is the bliss body. Phil Taiho, you're muted.
I was struck by the teaching within this about those of us who like to take koans as brain teasers. I don't know if they even use that phrase anymore, but I was reading about the lines and I thought of those tricks of, here are 8 matchsticks laid out in 2 squares. How by moving just one of them can you turn this into a circle? I think I still have that tendency that, clearly it's a modern approach to koans, but I think too, it must have been ancient if there were koan answer books for monks to use. If you can just get the answer and rather than understanding it or being comfortable with being confused. So
Right, and that, one of the patterns you're speaking there there is this, the pattern that we have of living our life in the head rather than the whole being, including the body. So, and the koan particularly has been, I think, largely in popular culture, as popular as it is, that is, as something like that, a mind thing, So, but you never really see any koan as long as you're swirling in the head. It's an embodiment, abrupt, non-dual embodiment. So, and the head, of course, is one of those patterns and our habitual thinking. We go through the same ruts, thinking about this, thinking about that, thinking about what happened in, 1983, and it's a defense. It's a defense against actually living and feeling and waking up. So we can let go of it. We can. Thank you. David. Breaking the pattern here, man. Where's David? Oh, there he is.
The many beings are numberless, vowing to carry them across. Greed, anger, and ignorance rise endlessly, vowing to cut off the mind road. Dharma gates are countless, vowing to awake to them all. Buddha's way is all embracing, vowing to follow through. So just two announcements before we end.